Hey everyone, welcome back to... Wait, that's not how we ever started.
That should take a minute. If we need a minute, let's all just reset. Deep breath.
I literally did like a double take there because I was looking at my notes, waiting for you to do the same intro you do every time.
Well,
and you didn't.
Here's the deal. I realized I started as welcome back, and anyone who's tuning in for the first time is not welcome back. They're joining us for the first time. So I wanted to try something
now instead.
I wanted to try, hey everyone, but you know what? We're just going to move past it.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm Cass Piancey, and I am here as usual with my partner in crime, Bennett Tomlin. I know he's doing good already. He knows I'm doing good. We're joined by a good friend of ours today, Daniel Goldman. How are you?
I'm also doing well. Thank you, Cass, and thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you. I guess I don't know what exactly what title you want to go by, but you are working for Arbitrum. What is your job title?
So with the company's Off-Chain Labs, we're working on Arbitrum, the protocol. I'm do software engineering and sort of technical research, technical communication, things like that.
Great.
Primarily engineering, though, yeah.
So this is a little bit of a different interview for us because we usually have people on to strictly discuss all the horrible issues with cryptocurrency. And I think we're not going to touch on that so much with this interview, but I do want to start it out by saying that you were one of the first people I met on here, and I was really happy to get to know you because you started the first Twitter bot that would announce every time Tether sent out a giant cascade of tethers. And back then, that was like a few millions. It wasn't the billions that we see now, but you were the first one to do that. So how did that happen?
Yeah, as you say, I do work in the industry, and obviously I'm excited and interested by it. But I've always kind of been like a hybrid crypto person, and I don't know, critic, skeptic, whatever you guys call yourselves. How that happened, let's see. So going back, so around that time, this is like 2017, 2018, and I was doing technical consulting with some friends. We started our own small business, and I think, my friend, we had just sort of become obsessed with the crypto space. He convinced me to quit my job at the time. I was a software engineer, and again, still am, and go into crypto full time. And I kind of there was this period of like a month or two where I just felt like as I sort of dove deeper, and we've all had those phases if you're in crypto where you just like deep dive and just devour and read everything you possibly can. I just kept getting like beaten over the head again and again with like these unpleasant surprises about projects I'd heard about or entities I'd heard about or things that I assumed I could sort of take their claims at face value or assume that there was something there, and they just turned out to be like bullshit or worse. Yeah, it was a number of things. It was just like one thing after another. Some of it was various like layer ones that were called altcoins at the time, making all sorts of claims about being the next Bitcoin or the next Ethereum and solving scalability. That just turned out to be nonsense. Enterprise blockchain was a big thing around the time. That's really fallen off the map in a good way, but it's easy to forget then that was like really, there was a lot of hype around that and a lot of money in that. And yeah, some of that stuff was just, beyond bullshit. Not even wrong, I guess, is probably the best way to describe it. But yeah, I think like top of the list of things that disillusioned me was Tether. So yeah, I started kind of making noise about it, and I was surprised, first of all, just diving into Tether, I was surprised that I could know about this space for so long and not having not heard of these things. But I was also just surprised by how little people seemed to care, I think. Particularly, I would say, the sort of Bitcoiner camp. So yeah, I started, I wrote a few things about Tether, some of which is probably fairly like cringe-inducing to look back on, but I felt the need to write it at the time. And then, yeah, the Twitter bot was just another way. I just felt like, it's just time for this industry to draw attention to this. I should say, not to break your heart, Cass, but to correct the record, I was not the first Tether bot. This is getting deep into crypto Twitter history. So for the crypto Twitter historians out there was another bot that was like Tether Reserve or something like that.
I just remember yours was incredibly accurate and fast, and maybe that's why I think about it that way. And that changed as well, because yours was mainly monitoring, or if not only monitoring Omni, which is the only chain that Tether was on when you started that. And as that started to devolve, as they've now, I don't know if it's 8 different blockchains, but it actually becomes more and more difficult to monitor that and create a bot to announce when that occurs, I would assume.
For sure. Well, actually, initially, Cass, is what I was going to say. Initially, so as the Tether stuff started coming out and there was the SEC subpoena and things like that, the way I remember it is in the wave of Tether getting more attention, they just sort of randomly announced that they would also be supporting Eurodollars. And that was initially the idea of just having a bot that just tracks the printing of Eurodollar tethers, was just really funny to me at the time. And that's how it started. It was just tracking Euros. And then it de facto became the replacement of the old printer, which I think got shut down, the other Twitter bot. It was all a bit strange. But yeah. So at first it was only Omni, which is actually how I started looking into Tether initially. It was just understanding technically what was going on there, I think, in terms of like what the Omni protocol was. Yeah, I was just very confused by what I was hearing. And then it made its way to Ethereum, and now I don't even know. I don't know if I could list every chain it's on. Seemingly all of them. Yeah.
EOS, Solana, BCH. What else do we have?
I can't list them all.
If
I
you
have
guys can't, I
followed
certainly
Tether
can.
for dozens of hours every week for 3.5 straight years, and I can't list all the chains it's on.
Yeah, so I would assume that would, if not be a full-time job, it would at least be like hours and hours of someone's week just to maintain that kind of thing. But yes, that is how we met, and I appreciated that a lot. And I'm wondering how you went from someone so skeptical to being, and I guess you were working on Lightning as well, or were you just an advocate of Lightning?
Sort of somewhere in this period where I was doing the 2017, 18, doing consulting and things like that, I became interested in Lightning and Layer 2. So I wasn't working directly on any of the Lightning Core projects, but I did some development work around it. Kind of around the same time.
And I'm not sure advocate's the best word either.
Complicated, I would say. Yeah. I was definitely very, I followed the whole block size war thing pretty closely and was definitely fascinated by it all. I think for a bit I was probably something like an advocate, but kind of quickly realized that, it was being oversold by a pretty wide margin. So then that's kind of what led me to Ethereum Layer 2 and so on. But through that and a number of other things, I think I kind of became like disillusioned with even the Bitcoin community in a lot of ways. Found myself more at home in the Ethereum world. Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, I guess we were talking to Oliver, and one of the major tribalistic differences that we were talking about is simply attitude. But I think it's interesting to see, like you were talking about enterprise blockchain and other issues like Tether, and see them as such intense issues. I would suspect. I mean, maybe not. But how do you see that and still go like, oh, but there's a lot of value here? Like, what is it that you think is so valuable that it is worth looking past that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I said, I've always sort of seen a lot of good and a lot of bad in the space. I think, the core fundamentals are still what interested me. So, the thing that got me interested initially is just the sort of protocols to build, disintermediated value transfer is sort of a new area. And it was and still is clear to me that will just like lead to all sorts of new things that haven't been explored yet. And because I sort of focus more on the technical side of things as a tech researcher, there is this mindset of the sort of engineering mindset of if it's interesting and there's cool problems to solve, then that's enough to keep me busy, which sometimes isn't a healthy mindset. I acknowledge, but it's endlessly fascinating. Yeah, like I've never lost interest in terms of like being optimistic or pessimistic or bullish or bearish. I do sort of oscillate. I do kind of sine wave over time. Yeah. But yeah, no. Again, as far as what interests me, it's nothing surprising. It's still the fundamentals. It's still just being able to transact value without trusted third parties and actually making this stuff work. Which the core challenges I think are still scalability and privacy. That's what got me into it, and that's like increasingly the stuff that I want to focus on the good. The bad I wouldn't say has like improved so much as in the case of Tether, it's funny like when we were first talking, this was, like I said, it was just a small handful of weirdos. No offense, but that was the perception. Is it's like, here's this group of people that are obsessed with this, and now we have like Janet Yellen holding hearings, and like, Jim Cramer's ranting about it, and Mark Cuban is endorsing Bennett Tomlin. So it just feels like there isn't much more for me to say here. I kind of like. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I almost feel like a lot of this history is forgotten, and that's a part of why I was so excited to have you on, because I think there was a crew of us back then who, there was Bitfinex who started all of it, but there was also people like you who were creating this bot that all of us relied on, and then there were people like Bennett and I who were taking over when Bitfinex went quiet there for a while, and trying to get some articles out and stuff like that. And it was genuinely like a communal effort of people trying to understand what the actual was going on with this company. But I do think that it's fascinating because it's kind of led us in two different directions, but both still keenly fascinated by this industry. And all of us can be bullish or bearish at different points, I'm sure. But in terms of like, that doesn't waver our fascination with this totally insane space, no matter which way you look at it.
Yeah, and I will just say for me, as I think I've told you before, in terms like, I just, following the ins and outs of what's going on with Tether and Bitfinex, I just burnt out on, like, I don't know how you guys have managed to stay focused this long. It's just, the sort of research that you guys have to do for the stuff you write, and just, going through court hearings and banking documents. Like, I just reached this point where I felt like, other people are talking about this, so I'll kind of move on.
But on that note, what is it that describe what Arbitrum is doing and what you're doing on Arbitrum? Let's talk about that, about your role and what you're trying to accomplish.
Sure. Yeah. So we can talk about scalability generally, but anyone who's used cryptocurrency probably knows that, fees and latency are an issue. But basically, and this has been sort of understood for a while, that there is this fundamental limitation you run into with using something like Bitcoin and Ethereum. The way I think about it is it kind of comes down to there's like a combination of three factors that lead to the fact that having a lot of throughput or transactions per second is difficult. It's technology that's peer-to-peer. You're doing value transfer, and there's this decision that we made, which is we want to make it relatively easy to run a node. So we've had peer-to-peer networks for a while. We know how those work. We've had digital value transfer before. Typically, you just had to use, trusted parties. Once you combine that with the fact that in this peer-to-peer network, we want it to be relatively easy to run a Bitcoin node or an Ethereum node, you run into this kind of limitation where, okay, all these nodes have to just literally share all of the work they're doing. So the blockchain, the record of all of the transactions that have ever gone on is replicated across every node. And then the part that I think confuses people is this cap, this limitation where Bitcoin can only do 3 transactions per second, more or less, Ethereum a little bit more, is essentially just a decision. It's just a cap that we decided because it's an ideological decision, really, of we want it to be fairly accessible for people to validate the chain themselves. So yeah, a few transactions per second isn't a lot, and this is a whole area of research, scalability research. I don't know to what extent you guys have discussed this, or we can assume your listeners are aware of this, but basically with layer 2, it's a broad term that people use a bit differently, but at least one notion of what layer 2 is taking this burden where all the participants in, say, the Ethereum chain have to process every single transaction, and kind of creating these separate environments where you can transact, and those who opt in, those who choose to, can validate, and you kind of only process them on layer 1 or process something on layer 1 if you absolutely need to. A guy, Ben Simon, I think, made this nice analogy of layer 2. It's like innocent until proven guilty, as opposed to layer 1 is just constantly proving everything is innocent. So this notion of do this optimistic execution and prove fraud if needed means that you can handle more throughput. That's a very broad explanation, trying to capture all sorts of layer 2s. Arbitrum is a specific type that you can't really do on Bitcoin because Bitcoin's base layer isn't flexible enough. But with Arbitrum, it's sort of like a sidechain kind of system, so you can kind of do all the functionality you have on Ethereum within Arbitrum, have this fraud-proof system, and kind of have it be cheaper. So we mentioned Lightning. Lightning, I tried to be broad enough that the explanation would include Lightning. Lightning has a similar flow where you're sort of instead of validating everything, you're in a way optimistically assuming it works, and then if fraud is committed, you can resort to the base layer. And the idea is you're inheriting security from the base layer, so you're not introducing any new trust assumptions. You know, to say it has the same security as the base layer, security is a very broad term, right? So it's hard to say that. Anytime you're doing anything with new software, you're introducing security risks, but the goal is to not introduce any sort of new third parties or trust risks.
Yeah, Arbitrum in specific is basically taking like sets of transactions, combining them together and marking that on the main, like through the sequencer into the main chain at certain points, right? And so then those can't be overwritten.
That's right. So part of where the scalability comes from is just that, where instead you could do sort of, as far as layer 1 is concerned, you're taking a bunch of layer 2 transactions and batching them into a single layer 1 transaction and posting that on chain. The real sort of scalability benefit here is what you're posting on chain is kind of this raw data that layer 1 doesn't, it's sort of this blob of data that layer 1 doesn't have to interpret. Any sort of interpretation happens on layer 2. So you're using layer 1 to make sure the data is available, you're using it to order the transactions, but the actual execution of them happens on layer 2 in such a way that anybody who wants to can prove fraud if need be. So layer 1 will allow fraud to be committed, an invalid update, like someone trying to steal your money, but it won't get finalized for a certain amount of time. And in that period, someone can sort of dispute it. And yeah, there's a guarantee that there's enough data available that anyone who wants to can do this sort of dispute. So yeah, the whole goal is to sort of like use L1 block space more efficiently and without just like offloading into some other trusted third party or trusted environment.
There's a couple of different directions I kind of want to take that. And I think the first one that might be useful for some of our listeners is to discuss what trade-offs you are making when you, for example, bridge your Ethereum over to Arbitrum and use it in executions there versus doing those on level 1.
So in terms of like from a user perspective, let's say, first of all, the trade-off is exactly what you said there is you do have to do the step of actually depositing it, right? So there's a UX trade-off of it's a thing you have to do. But that's what it looks like. It's, you know, depositing either Ether or tokens or whatever it is into this other environment. I would say the core trade-off then is sort of as long as it's there, as long as it's on Arbitrum, you can't directly compose with other contracts on Ethereum the way you can if you're using some other layer 1 thing. So you want to, you can think of it as a separate chain, and it is in fact a blockchain, right? So you're sort of like, while you're in Arbitrum, you're kind of restricted to interacting with things that are also on Arbitrum. And then the big trade-off is to move them back, you have to wait. If you're sort of sending any message from layer 2 to layer 1, so this could be like a withdrawal, there is this week-long period where you have to wait for it to finalize, and that's to give time for this kind of fraud-proof thing to happen. When it comes to tokens, fungible things, you can like do tricks like atomic swaps to bypass that week-long period. Core downside from a user perspective, let's say, compared to using layer 1, there's all sorts of, I'm not suggesting that's the only downside, but yeah.
Does that immediately mean that your main customer base is not like retail? It's going to be institutions and stuff like that? Because what you would need for every retail user to use Arbitrum is an understanding of Ethereum, and then they would you're already forcing them to learn about more than one thing versus like, I guess my point being that if someone just wants to buy some Ethereum or whatever, like who does this benefit right now if it's not benefiting people newly acquiring Ethereum, not understanding how to utilize it in these other ways?
I would say like the targets here are more users than institutions, because the core benefit is like lower fees and faster transactions, although we can talk more about that. But yeah, so I think like the targets are users, because users sort of care more about fees going up. I mean, it's interesting the way you even said that. There's a question to ask of what people are willing to do versus how much they understand generally in this space, which is to say people use things they don't understand all the time. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but look, part of why I write the sorts of stuff I do is to try to help bridge that gap and to just give people the ability to like reason about technical things themselves as much as possible. From a user perspective, the thing about something like Arbitrum, and this is one of, I think, the key differentiators between like some of these Ethereum L2s like Arbitrum and say Lightning, is the UX from a user is actually very similar. And that's kind of because a lot of most in fact of the wallets, infrastructure, dev tooling, things like that, it's fairly easy to apply that already exists on Ethereum. It's fairly easy to apply that to a sort of blockchain or sidechain like L2, like Arbitrum. Whereas Lightning just requires all this new stuff.
And like For example, it'd be possible for Coinbase to allow their users to withdraw directly to a level 2 like Arbitrum in most cases too, right? So where they wouldn't even have to touch the main chain until they were ready to exit the layer 2 back to either a different custodial or a non-custodial solution.
Yeah, exactly. And we have some exchanges doing that already. I think, I forget what's live, so I don't want to say specifically who it is, but certainly some will soon. And yeah, in terms of acquiring Ether, that's part of the idea.
And so I've been trying to think through the security implications and some of that for this. Is basically the worst case scenario, like if the Arbitrum validators are colluding or whatever, your worst case is just you submit the fraud proof and you have to wait a week, right?
That's right, yeah. So basically the Arbitrum validator, so being an Arbitrum validator is permissionless, or like will be when the system is in its full form. So yeah, there's no, you're trusting that there's at least one honest validator, or you can be a validator yourself. So as long as there is one honest party validating, then yes, as you say, if there is an invalid state transition that happens, the worst case scenario is you'll have to wait a week, and waiting a week is only for outgoing messages. So people who are trying to withdraw get this unpleasant surprise that they have to wait longer. The party that committed fraud also, will provably be punished. So this being a validator requires stake, so it's going to cost you money to delay the chain. And that's one thing we're sort of thinking about now is probably we want to at least to start the amount required to stake will be on the high side, so that we discourage these kind of delay attacks, which, there's a trade-off there because that restricts who's actually going to run a validator. But yeah, that's one of the reasons to have a relatively high stake, is to make it costly to do the sort of attack you described.
One of the things you mentioned earlier is that when you were investigating Lightning, you became disillusioned with the way it was being marketed versus some of the trade-offs inherent in its use. Are there any specific trade-offs that you think are especially important for people to think of when it comes to Lightning in specific?
Yeah. And again, this is another thing that would be obvious to anyone who actually tries to use it, which is only a small subset of the people who, for example, talk about it. But what's less obvious is why and how this works. Yeah, I mean, it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with Lightning, and it's cool technology, and I'm all for it being used as much as possible. The thing that was getting annoying to me, as you said, is the way it was sort of being pitched and sold was as effectively a replacement, right? Or not a replacement, but that this would be the standard way a user uses Bitcoin, right? And this will kind of, as this sort of block size drama was going on, it was we have a solution. It's fine. We don't need bigger blocks. Everyone will just use Lightning. And as a sort of generalized solution for peer-to-peer payments, it has all sorts of problems. I mean, a lot of it comes down to this issue of liquidity. Unlike stuff like Arbitrum or stuff like Plasma or even other sidechain type of things, the Lightning Network uses channels. And basically, what a Lightning channel is...
Wait, didn't Plasma use state channels?
So state channels are sort of a separate, that's like channels on Ethereum, basically. Plasma is a separate construct. Plasma's closer to rollups like Arbitrum, okay. I would say.
Maybe I'm thinking of Raiden.
Raiden was a channels thing, right? So anything that uses channels, basically, if you're trying to sort of generalize it, a given channel is this very tight coupled agreement between, let's say, two parties. It could be more parties, but it's usually going to be two, where you're sort of locking up some capital, let's say, or some state, but let's say it's some tokens or Bitcoin or Ether or whatever. And you kind of make this smart contract agreement that says, so long as this channel is open, we can kind of pay each other with the funds that we have locked up, but only each other. That's maybe the easiest way to summarize it. So if you want to pay someone you don't have a channel open with, you have to kind of route your payment through, you have to find a path, right? So if I have a channel with Bennett and Bennett has a channel with Cass, and I don't have a channel with Cass, I can maybe pay Cass through Bennett. So that's already, you see, it's sort of like the closest analog would be a credit network, the analog in traditional finance, but you're not using credit, right? So it has to all be directly collateralized. So there is this question of, is there even a way to pay the party you want to pay? Which there might not be. There might literally be not currently possible without an L1 transaction. But then what's become more obvious to me is even just practically speaking, that's the principled limitation. Practically speaking, there's just all sorts of other things that can go wrong. Even if there is a path of liquidity, how do you find it? So you need this fairly complex overlay network infrastructure. And also, again, if you've used Lightning, you can open up a channel with someone and then maybe they're offline when you want to interact, or their IP address changes. So all this networking stuff kind of makes it messy.
But isn't it being used for the Chivo wallet in El Salvador?
That's a good question. And what I would say is, generally speaking, when you hear Lightning being what's happened, the way this has played out, and it's, unfortunately fairly predictable, is that when you hear about Lightning being used, it's usually just a custodial wallet, which is to say, a user is effectively trusting some other party to use their wallet. This seems to be what's going on in El Salvador. I should dive deeper to say anything more concrete, but I don't think there's many users using Lightning in sort of a trustless way in El Salvador. So yeah, and I think the reason that's played out is, again, the UX is tough. The UX for anything custodial is going to be nicer, and it's always just a good look to be like, hey, we're accepting Lightning payments, or we have this Lightning wallet. And so yeah, there's been a lot of smaller versions of this. El Salvador is probably the biggest one.
And having the custodial wallets, like these major providers on the network, helps partially solve the liquidity issue you were talking about previously.
Yeah.
Because in the case where, let's say you're trying to send 1 Bitcoin to Cass, and I've got a channel open with him and a channel open with you. If I've only got a half Bitcoin worth of liquidity locked in my channels, you can't make that payment through me. And so it can be helpful to have these major liquidity providers on this network that are going to consistently have that available. But then, as we're getting to, the trade-off is you're centralizing into basically this hub and spoke model with people trusting custodians.
That's right, yeah. And the centralized hub and spoke model, if it works, it's at least, you could say it's still trustless and potentially non-custodial. But yeah, then you have these single points of, if not failure, at least major inconvenience, which itself is not good. And then, just the more you sort of start thinking about it, you're like, this architecture the truth is, the reason Bitcoin settled on this as the, darling favorite layer 2 scaling solution is just because it's the only thing that was really possible. In fact, even making Lightning possible required a number of soft forks to Bitcoin script. Even Lightning itself, if you look at how it's the implementation on the Bitcoin script, which is the Bitcoin smart contract language, it's very it's very strange. It feels more like a hack. You're just sort of using these certain operations in ways that they weren't quite intended for, and this just kind of happens to work, and Bitcoiners don't like changing their protocol at all, so we're going to use it. I mean, that's why this was the closest thing available. So it's let's just push this as far as it can go. But if you sort of zoom out and look at the wider space of what protocols are possible in terms of general purpose scaling, there's just much better ways. I tend to think channels like Lightning are good for certain things. To me, they're good for situations where you can credibly predict a very small number of parties want to do something with each other. I like the idea of exchanges using it amongst themselves. And I think that's starting to happen a bit. Some exchanges are using it, but that's always made sense to me. That seemed like a better place to start. If you need instant finality, that's good, because Lightning is really the only way you can get instant trustless finality, or channels is the only way you can. But even then, it's there aren't that many cases where users really need that, is what's funny. Things like maybe games, you need that fast transactions, but do you really need it to be final instantly? I don't know. Where we're seeing channels actually get used the most, maybe even more than Lightning, according to some things I've heard claimed, is for cross-chain interoperability. There's some Ethereum-related projects, cross-chain meaning between layer 1 and layer 2, to bypass that withdrawal period, like I said, or even between different layer 1s. That is a sort of nice and natural use case for them where there does seem to be a demand. So yeah, there's certain cases where it's good. Micropayments is another, if you want to stream micropayments, if you think that's a good idea. You kind of need to use channels, but as this is how peer-to-peer payments will work now, it's just, it became kind of clear to me that's not going to happen, and it doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, one of the things you touched on there was funny to me is the idea of the state channels between exchanges, because that's often seemed like a better solution than 95% of what Liquid does for Bitcoin. The main use case for Liquid, besides issuing tokens no one uses and shutting down for 24 hours at a time, is to enable quicker inter-exchange arbitrage for these players. And that seems like it can be done just as effectively trusting these state channels rather than an N of M multisig.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is just one of the ironies of the Liquid project, which, I've pointed out, and I think you have too, is, this is kind of how they're pitching it, is this is what we should use for exchange, and how they're, distinguishing themselves from Lightning, whereas, actually, that's probably one of the better use cases for Lightning, and, Liquid, I don't think really makes sense at all, so,
And just to further add on there, that's one of the best use cases for Lightning too, because often payments on those channels are going to go both ways. So you don't end up with them ending up super imbalanced in one direction.
Exactly, right. So you have exchanges settling between each other often for whatever reason. Yeah, it's you have, for whatever reason, there's a lot of activity between exchanges, and whatever reason that may be, it is just it makes more sense to, take that activity off the base layer. And Lightning's a nice way to do that. Also, exchanges already have infrastructure in place. They're running nodes. So it's like a better sell to have them use this than average users. And again, I think some exchanges are messing with this, but yeah, I think part of what's impeding that is like some of the leading figures who at least were the leading figures that implemented Lightning are now pushing Liquid, and they're trying to like capture that side of things. I'm talking about Blockstream, obviously. I don't need to tiptoe around that. Liquid in general. It's one of the strangest directions that like Bitcoin world has gone in. That Liquid was at all embraced is quite shocking because it is, as you say, just a multi-sig when you get down to it, and many act like it's something more novel or interesting. So yeah.
Well, I'm proud to say that I was not a fan
Of Liquid?
of Lightning.
Of Lightning, sure. Yeah.
It's cool tech.
I mean, at this point, Bitcoiners have kind of moved on, too, is the sense that I get. I think increasingly, maybe moved on is too strong, but increasingly it's like there is this tacit acceptance that, the important thing is the 21 million supply cap, and like if we need to use custodial solutions, that's kind of okay. So, yeah, I don't hear the same level of hype as before. I think there's just this low-key sense of let's just move on, and yeah.
I think
that's just
part of that might derive from who you follow and who you discuss recently. Because with Chivo, Strike, and Mallers, there's a whole bunch of Bitcoiners who use the word Lightning frequently. But like the thing we're kind of getting at here, many of them seem to no longer value the trustlessness possible with Lightning as much as they do its utility in its often custodial form to make these smaller payments.
Yeah, and I think that narrative just seems to be creeping over Bitcoin. Again, I think partly it is just sort of pragmatically because there are fewer options. There's really very few options to do, trustless things on Bitcoin that aren't just using layer one. So yeah, you're just seeing the narrative evolve of, hey, maybe that's not what's important. There's a lot you could say about Ethereum and Ethereum layer twos, and there's certainly, I'm not suggesting that world is perfect, but it's like, there's at least more effort being put into expanding sort of what's possible in the trustless security model. So that's sort of, I don't know, where I've increasingly been focusing my time and energy.
Well, Ethereum is also now deflationary. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Not necessarily. Ethereum now, so since EIP 1559, there was a change in how fees work.
Sorry, can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so I didn't think we'd get into this, but let's do it. 1559 is, so an EIP is an Ethereum improvement proposal. 1559 just happened to be the number of, on GitHub. This was a proposal to change how fees work on Ethereum, or to change a number of things. And I actually think it's generally a good thing and was a good idea. This has to do with, on Bitcoin you have the block size limit, on Ethereum you have the gas limit, but it's the same idea. It's this cap on how much activity can take place. Part of the idea of 1559 is you add some like elasticity here. So you say, right, so let me back up for a second. So you have a limit to how much, on Ethereum, the amount of gas, the amount of computation that can take place in a given amount of time, how much can happen in a given block. And the idea is, before 1559, and the way Bitcoin still works is if that's full, everyone just increases their fees. You're just basically bidding for block space. You're trying to convince miners to include your transactions, and that's that. With the 1559 model, you sort of introduce a base fee that's part of the protocol. So instead of just being this kind of, off-chain market that basically takes place, there is a notion of a fee within Ethereum. And the way it works is as a block starts to fill up, you have some elasticity. So instead of having this hard limit, you, as it gets closer to that limit, you allow a little bit more up to a certain cap. So the block size can kind of expand and contract, if that makes sense. And as it expands, the fee, this base fee, just goes up. So the idea is we'll allow some more activity, but we're going to force you to pay more. And that way it won't last long, and then it will contract again. So one of the consequences of that, the way I would think about it, is that in and of itself would create this sort of perverse incentive of miners to just fill up blocks with transactions. And that would be bad, because now they can just deliberately increase the fees, which arguably they could do before and can do now on Bitcoin anyway, but it's especially bad in this new system. Now they have direct reason to just increase this base fee. So we say, okay, the fee is split up into these two parts now. There's the base fee, and then there's the tip. The tip is the part the miner keeps. The base fee just gets burned. And that way a miner can't do this attack, right? Because it just becomes costly for them. They don't collect the base fee themselves. So that's a nice solution. And I think that is that is the good reason to have this base fee be burned, is that, yeah, it just sort of lets you have, again, this elasticity, and also fixes what was arguably a problem before, which is miners can just fill up blocks for free. What happened was a lot of people really ran with this idea of, hey, we're starting to burn some ether. And, there was this like narrative move of Bitcoiners like talking about sound money. Why don't we start talking about ether becoming sound money too? Because, as you say, hey, now we're going to start burning ether. That makes it deflationary. I find it very silly, maybe even absurd. But yeah, that kind of for a lot of people became the key thing about this change. One thing I find interesting, and maybe this applies to just a lot of things in life, but especially in the crypto space, is there's this unspoken layer, like when it comes to messaging, whether it's like a company in the space or even like people who are really into a certain layer one, there's always this unspoken thing of trying to differentiate yourself with a competitor. And I think much more than Ethereum people want to admit, there is this game of like, how do we compete with Bitcoiners? Differentiate or compete, right? And yeah, with certain types of like ETH people, they really are, they're probably consciously doing that. And this is one example of like, how do we compete with the sound money meme? I think with Bitcoiners, there's a lot of distinguishing themselves with Bitcoin Cash for a while. And that's why it's like, now it's all about running a full node is what's important. That's why Lightning is great, There's all sorts of examples of that. We even do it to some extent, Arbitrum does, But yeah, in this case, I think that's a lot of what was going on. And that happens more than people want to admit, of like, how do we as Ethereum separate ourselves from either Bitcoin or the latest like Ethereum killer chain, So that's kind of what I saw here. It seemed very like, not quite cynical, but a bit almost too obvious, It's like, come on, guys. But with that said, so I think, is Ethereum deflationary? So it sort of depends on, it's hard to predict because it depends on how much of these fees actually get paid. So far it is a shocking amount of ether has been burned since this happened, but I don't know if it's enough to keep pace with the ether. I haven't looked at the data yet, but yeah, if someone just says ETH is deflationary, they're probably being silly, and yeah.
It does seem like a bad idea to take Bitcoiners' misunderstanding and claim it as your own.
That's the other thing. Yeah, it's almost like you're just taking a narrative that's popular, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should try to create your own version of it, guys. You don't have to do that. But that was obviously what was going on there. But yeah, it's funny because I actually do think protocol-wise, 1559 and the changes I discussed make sense and is a good idea. It's just the thing that's cool about it isn't that, now we created sound money. Yeah.
It's harder to get people excited about elastic block sizes that respond.
It is, yeah. And like maybe better UX. Yeah, it's like everything else is very subtle, but like number go up is less subtle. So.
And I actually appreciate our listeners might not know this. I assume most of them do. Bennett and I have never met. Daniel, you and I have met 2 or 3 times now. So I've met Daniel numerous times now, and it's always fun hanging out with you because we hang out with one of our BCH friends. So it's like a no-coiner, a guy who's into Ethereum layer 2 and a BCH proponent hanging out and discussing cryptocurrency together. And it got me reflecting that you're one of the people who's able to tread that line pretty well, I've noticed, of like not stepping on people's toes so much when it comes to these, I don't even know how, but these very intense subjects, it turns out. But I'm wondering if it's just because you don't, not that you don't take them seriously, but that you kind of accept that there's a number of solutions to all of these problems and maybe anyone is right, or if you kind of, I'm just wondering how you navigate this space so Swiss for so long.
It is funny that that we could hang out, the 3 of us. I think that's how world peace starts. I think that's it. I don't know. I mean, the tribalism has gotten worse in this space, I would say, and I've always found it silly. And I've always just kind of hopped around. I mean, I think that part of that is just like epistemic humility, which I think is a valuable quality. But I also just think when it comes to tribalism, in a way, like, it's very natural that it will happen in the crypto space, and it's almost a built-in feature that these communities will form and then, try to exclude others. I think I used to get more sort of frustrated by it. For a bit I was like half Bitcoin, half Ethereum in my focus, and that just like doesn't work, it turns out. I think more than anything, the people I'm willing to sort of hang out with and associate with, it's not so much about which tribe you're a part of, there's a general sense of intellectual honesty is sort of the underlying important thing. Yeah, the person you mentioned, maybe we shouldn't even say who it is, I don't know. But the Bitcoin casher that you mentioned, I think like we obviously have disagreements, but at a certain point, it's, I can sort of, he's intelligent, he's like willing to cast doubt on his own ideas. He's willing to listen to other viewpoints, and it's like just becomes useless to keep having the same arguments again and again. So yeah, I think that's if there's something on my radar, it's that just like general intellectual honesty and openness, and yeah, you can find that in all sorts of places, even in very surprising places. As I won't say who this is, and I don't think I said it last time, but I said publicly, I spoke to someone in the BSV world that like I was surprised. It changed my view, not so much of BSV, but it made me think like I just assumed that to even remotely be in that world, you would have to be, whatever, frankly, kind of insane. And this person was not. And I very much disagreed with her on all sorts of things, but I thought, okay, like, people can be wrong and not be people, I guess.
Yeah. And on that note, I mean, this is probably the biggest part of the podcast. Thank you, Daniel, for coming on to announce the Arbitrum token.
Swear to God. Why are you doing this to him, Gas?
I thought you would open with this, to be honest. So I'm just glad you waited.
I know it was about opening with it, but yeah. For everyone listening, no, there is no Arbitrum token, and I like to think that I was responsible for that, but actually, you were getting asked questions about that before I ever said anything. Is that right?
Yeah, so, when you're in the Ethereum space and don't have a token and have any level of success, that is just the most common question you get. I've learned. But what you're referring to, if I remember, so where was it? I mean, there was some article that referred to like rumors have been spreading that Arbitrum's gonna and the sense that I think they even linked to like some of your tweets or something, where you guys were just doing this just to troll me.
Whoops.
And at that point you can't really argue like a rumor has been spread. That fact is true. So what can I say?
Yeah, I kept thinking, just for our listeners, I kept thinking the Twitter sphere, thinking Daniel on the Twitter sphere for airdropping me these Arbitrum tokens that did not exist. But I think we discussed trolling you about this briefly, but I do want to just quickly touch on like the idea that you don't necessarily need a token for your project, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what it comes down to. I should also say, I'm not one of the founders, to be clear, so it's not as though I have this unilateral decision. But I'm heavily involved. I joined fairly early on, so, I bear responsibility for what we do. And, I mean, as you say, look, I mean, it's obvious why people are asking if we want a token, because they want a piece of the airdrop. Like, that's what it comes down to. But from our perspective, it's like, yeah, there's just the burden of proof should go in the other direction, right? Like, what reason do you have to introduce a token? And if you can give me a good one, then we'll talk. But yeah, I mean, look, if we're being honest, the primary reason for introducing most tokens is like to make money for somebody. I'm all for making money. I'm nothing against that. I would love to have more. But in terms of where we're at, like, we're fortunate enough that, we closed a Series B round. We're doing well. Our protocol is generating revenue. So like, that's not an issue. And yeah, if, the fact that random people want part of an airdrop, like, good luck to you in whatever you do, but also it's not, our primary goal to make those people money. So yeah, I mean, when you look at other designs of why protocols have tokens, like, I mean, I shouldn't say anything specific, because if I say anything, this could get clipped, but, there's most of the reasons tend to be very bad. I can think of a few that could potentially make sense, but yeah, no one even wants to have that discussion. It's just like when token. But we are not planning on any of those things. Yeah, to be very clear. I regret even saying that. I won't be more specific than that.
Well, I only bring it up because there are other people, and maybe they don't do it as much anymore, and I will name them. I will say Anthony Pompliano, who makes a point of talking about tokenizing the world, or used to. I don't know if that's still his fucking MO or not, but...
that's a 2018 slogan. That's 3 years dead, Cass.
I don't know what fucking... I've been blocked for 4 years, so I don't know what the deal is anymore.
He stopped saying the virus is spreading, too.
Yeah.
Thank God.
I tried to warn him. I really did. In 2019, I said to him, Pomp, viruses are bad. You keep saying the virus is spreading. You shouldn't say that. And he's
Did you really?
Yeah. There's like proof. You could find it. I said to him, viruses are bad. Please stop saying this. And he's like, actually, viruses can be good if you look up the definition of a virus. And then I looked up the definition and I was like, what the f*** are you talking about, man? they're bad. Like they're genuinely bad. But yeah, so I just think it's nice for me to see a project that seems to be working successfully, regardless of how I feel about the ecosystem at large. It's nice to see a project working successfully that's not like, anyway, so here's our new token airdrop. If you had Ethereum since da-da-da date, then you're going to get our free token for being able to stake Arbitrum. I don't know. Just thank God you're not jumping in that direction, at least right away. It's such a gimmick in the space now.
For sure, yeah. Right away, and we have absolutely no plans to. Again, it's like, if the founders are planning something, they haven't told me. So I know as much as anybody. But yeah, from discussing it with them, it's just not, as you said, there's just no good reason for it. Which is, that was one of the reasons I was, one of the reasons I wanted to join, frankly, was understanding that wouldn't be a factor. It is weird how, I was talking about back in 2017 and 18 doing consulting, like that was during the ICO boom, where there was a certain type of, the whole sort of, there was a certain type of every project having their own token then, and then there was kind of pushback for a while, and now it's sort of coming back in a different form. I do think that, there's certain, the idea, like, at the time it was literally like anything that existed had to have its own token just to do payments. And, like, no one's really even claiming that anymore because that's obviously a bad idea.
Now you make an NFT of everything.
Yeah, now NFTs are the new hotness, of course. And with tokens, it's like there's governance tokens that are more common. There's a few that make more sense. Like, I would say it's a little less insane than the ICO boom, but at the same time, like, as you say, the fact that people just expect it and, frankly, demand it of me is kind of a weird. Yeah, I don't know why they DM me all the time. I guess I'm just because I'm vocal about Arbitrum generally on Twitter.
I did specifically tell them to DM you to get free Arbitrum tokens, so that could have something to do.
That explains it.
Cass, are you sure you're Daniel's friend?
Bennett, I don't know if you have any more questions that you want to pose before we hop off.
I mean, I could rant for a long time about tons of different things, but I have half a thought, and I'm not sure I know how to articulate it. And it basically comes down to the fact that oftentimes Bitcoin's own designs for level 2 seem to end up becoming economically unsustainable. And that largely comes down to the fact that long-term Bitcoin's security budget becomes however much people are willing to pay to transact on level 1. Right now, the direction of Bitcoin seems to be that is going to be a small number of very expensive transactions. And to trustlessly use a level 2, you need to be able to transact on level 1. And so when you have the system designed like that, it seems like Lightning was always and inevitably going to end up with primarily custodial providers. And one of the reasons I appreciate a lot of the Ethereum design ethos is because even in a case in EIP 1559, like what might happen after the merge where it becomes deflationary, there's still the continual issuance to those providing the security to the network. So you help avoid the security budget becoming only the fees being paid to transact. And so because of that, it's possible to maintain level 1 fees low enough that you can have reasonable trustlessness for a larger subset of users. I'm trying to be very careful with my words here because this is not my expertise, but just, it's not even really a question. It's just, I appreciate that fundamental difference in the design ethos, and I worry that many Bitcoiners have not fully probed the end game for what Bitcoin looks like.
I mean, I agree. I always thought, like, it's sort of an unpopular opinion, I guess, in this space, but that the, like, steady state inflation, steady issuance was a plus for Ethereum compared to Bitcoin. And yeah, with 1559, you sort of get the best of both worlds because you can keep issuing, and if you're someone who cares about having, like, a low supply cap, then maybe you get that too to some extent. But yeah, I mean, as you say, in terms of just long-term security, yeah, I mean, I've always thought it's just very unclear what Bitcoin will look like when and if it has zero issuance. And yeah, I don't think that is something to take seriously. And then in terms of where that like as you say, with layer 2s, really any of them, there still is, no matter what you're doing, you still don't want ridiculously high fees on layer 1 because there is this worst case where you're going to have to take recourse on layer 1, right? Like you still need to interact with it sometimes. With Lightning, this is especially pronounced where, again, because you have situations where you're effectively forced to close a channel to maintain security of your funds, which is just direct L1 interaction. So yeah, I think like some of the scalability that, speaking of going back to just some of the Lightning narratives not making sense, some of those about like layer 1 will become mega expensive, but it won't matter because users won't have to use layer 1. Like what you're secretly saying there is people use custodial solutions. You're just saying it in very coded language. So yeah, it's the economics of how this plays out is still a broad question of like the relationship between security and layer 1 fees and issuance. Even including with something like Ethereum. You brought up our Bitcoin Cash friend, and one of the things that people like him like to bring up
it's our
about
buddy
Lightning.
at imaginary username im_uname. We can totally say his Twitter name. It's fine.
One of the things they like to bring up is, as a sort of dig on Lightning, is that effectively like by undercutting layer 1 fees, you're undercutting security, which I think is an interesting argument and kind of a weird one. I don't really see it that way. I think like, again, if you can use block space more efficiently, that is just good, strictly. So layer 2 is kind of like increase the lanes of this highway where more activity can happen for a given block for the same amount of security. So I don't know if that's at all what you were getting at, Bennett, but I don't have those concerns that like of layer 2 sort of leeching off of L1 security. But yeah, the relationship between layer 1 fees, layer 2 fees, and even, Ethereum as 1559 plays out, there's still definitely a lot of open questions there.
Yeah, so I didn't ask a great question there. I was just mostly ranting about economic models and Bitcoiners. It was great to have you here, Daniel.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Like I said, I feel like we could go for just many more hours, but yeah, anytime.
Yeah, well, we appreciate it, and thank you for joining us. Everyone can find you on Twitter at DZAC23, and, I clicked onto your Substack today. You haven't updated that for over a year.
Good point. I should update that, yeah.
That's getting some more writing done.
Yeah, maybe I'll post this appearance next.
There you go. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know how you want people to find you. Feel free to, promote yourself or whatever.
Yeah, Twitter's good, at DZAC23. That's Daniel, still no Arbitrum token, Goldman. You didn't read that part, but that's the actual username. I just wanted to get that in there. And yeah, Arbitrum's, again, the main thing I'm working on now, so you can follow what's going on there.
And no fucking token.
Except for the secret tokens we got in the airdrop.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, don't mention that.